Good evening, everyone. Great to have you here. Welcome to Medill. My name is Tim Franklin, and I'm the Senior Associate Dean here at Medill, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this inaugural event of the Medill Fall Speaker Series. And I hope that you will join us at the same time in the same place next Friday for our next Speaker Series event with our Medill colleague Melissa Isaacson, author of the new book, State, A Team, a Triumph, and a Transformation. The following Friday, October 18th, we'll be welcoming Max Barak, the Washington Post's Nairobi bureau chief and the recipient of the 2018 James Foley Medill Medal for Courage in Journalism. And there's more. On October 30th, we'll host Julia Wallace and Kristen Gilger, authors of the book, There's No Crying in Newsrooms, What Women Have Learned About What It Takes to Lead. And there's even more programming planned for next month, so please check it out on medill.school/events for more information. And thank you for being here with us this evening on this gloomy, rainy fall day in Chicago. So this evening, we're here for a conversation about investigative reporting with two of the best practitioners of that craft in America. And the timing of this discussion is absolutely exquisite. In recent months, we've seen the vital role investigative reporting plays in our country and in our communities. The Miami Herald's Julie K. Brown broke the story of the Jeffrey Epstein sex trafficking scandal. The New York Times' Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey unearthed decades of sexual abuse allegations against Harvey Weinstein, igniting the Me Too movement in our country. The South Florida Sun-Sentinel just last year exposed failings by law enforcement and school officials before and after the mass shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. So as vital as this work is, however, it's also under threat these days because of the disruption in the business model for news and in rising threats against journalists, both here and around the world. So here to unpack all of this for us are two highly decorated investigative journalists. First, please join me in giving a welcome to a new member of Medill's faculty, Debbie Cenziper, who's with us this evening. It's great to have Debbie. She's the director of the newly announced Medill Investigative Lab and is an associate professor here. Debbie is a national award-winning investigative reporter at the Washington Post, and before that, the Miami Herald. In 2007, while at the Herald, Debbie received the Pulitzer Prize for local reporting for a year-long investigation about affordable housing corruption. And on November 12th, Debbie's newest book, Citizen 865, The Hunt for Hitler's Hidden Soldiers in America, will be released. This book is the gripping story of a team of Nazi hunters at the U.S. Justice Department racing against time to expose members of a brutal SS killing force who disappeared in America after World War II. I can't wait to read it, Debbie.
Thank you.
And I'm sure you can't wait for it to be released. She's joined on stage by our special guest and Medill alumnus, David Barstow. Earlier this year, while at the New York Times, David became the first reporter in history to win four Pulitzer Prizes. It's amazing. His fourth Pulitzer was awarded in April. He and two Times colleagues were awarded the prize for explanatory reporting for an 18-month investigation of President Donald Trump's finances. The reporting debunked Trump's claims of self-made wealth and revealed a business empire riddled with tax dodges. David also won the Pulitzer Prizes for investigative reporting in 2013 and 2009. And the 2004 Prize for Public Service Journalism. He also was a Pulitzer Prize finalist 3 other times while working as a reporter at the St. Petersburg Times, now the Tampa Bay Times. I don't know if it's fair to monopolize the Pulitzer Prize quite that way, David. David joined the Times in 1999 He left the Times in July to become the new head of investigative reporting at the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. While he's working at Berkeley, though, we like to think of David as a Medillian. He's a graduate of Medill and was inducted into the Medill Hall of Achievement in 2015. So please join me in giving a welcome return home to David Barstow.
Welcome back, David.
Thank you.
So I have some opening questions, and then I'm going to open it up to everybody here, because I know everyone's got a number of questions for David. But I thought I would start with a most obvious question, which is, did you always know you wanted to be a journalist? When did you decide you wanted to go into journalism?
I didn't actually. I knew, I mean, as a kid, my parents thought I had a problem because I read so much. We would go on vacations to gorgeous Cape Cod, and I would spend the entire time in a bunk bed in a darkened room reading books. And so I knew I loved to read, and I knew I was kind of ridiculously curious, and I drove my family nuts with all of those questions like, why is that and what is that? But I didn't actually know what to do with those things. And my introduction to journalism it's not a particularly noble story. I was in high school, I played on a soccer team, the high school soccer team, and I was really outraged that the local newspaper gave all of the coverage to the football team that was really not very good. And the soccer team was pretty good, and I was like, I just thought this was such an offense to mankind that the local paper, so I actually walked to the newspaper and demanded to see the sports editor and complained. And the sports editor very smartly said, well, you know, if you want to write stories about your soccer team, we'll publish them. And so I couldn't say no. I didn't actually really want to do that. I didn't really, but I couldn't, having made the big point, I couldn't just sort of walk away. So that's like, actually I started writing stories for the local paper about our soccer team to rectify this terrible injustice.
So you started rather young.
Yeah, but I didn't, I still wasn't quite sure. I still wasn't quite sure exactly what I wanted to do. I actually think, oddly enough, I think a moment that was really important to me had actually nothing to do with journalism that I recognized in the moment. So I was adopted. And I grew up knowing I was adopted, but as I got into my teenage years, I found myself increasingly curious to know who my biological parents were. And once that curiosity gets a hold of you, it's really hard to tamp it down. And so I went to the Bureau of Vital Statistics in Boston, which is the keeper of birth certificates in Massachusetts. And I just had this simple idea, well, I'll just ask to see my birth certificate, and maybe that will list my biological mom and dad. And so I requested I went and found the right book and page and asked the clerk to bring the book to the counter, and she opened the book up in front of me, but she held her arms like this over the pages of the book. And so there was my name, but then in the mother and father spaces were Fred and Dorothy Barstow, my adopted parents. But it did say in a big stamp across the top in red, it said adopted. So I eventually, I asked the clerk, why are you holding the pages? And she said, well, in adoption cases, there's confidential information that's on the backside of the birth certificate, and so we need to make sure to protect that information. And so, of course, I thought, okay, well, that's got to be the information I'm looking for. It must be the name of my birth parents. And so I left, and then it kind of dawned on me, well, maybe if I could somehow if I could just ask for the next birth certificate, the one that followed mine, then I would be looking at the back of my birth certificate. And so I went back and I just asked for the next page, right? I want to see the birth certificate. And they said, no, you have to have a name. So they were sort of onto this ruse, I guess. And so I spent a fair amount of time trying to reverse engineer the index system to see if I could figure out whose name would be the next one. And I thought I had hit upon the name. And so I went back and asked for the page number again with this name. And lo and behold, they brought the book out. And so I'm looking at this page, which was the one I didn't care about. And then at this page was the back of what I hoped was my birth certificate, which in fact had a name of a birth mother on there. Now this one, luckily for me, it didn't have the stamp adopted on the top of it. So the clerk kind of turned away and wasn't paying close attention. And so I peeked underneath really quick just to make sure I was really looking at mine. And sure enough, it was mine. And I remember vividly, I remember a couple things really vividly about that moment. I remember, first of all, how wonderful it felt to be in this place with all of these dusty records. And I remember how like that felt like home to me, being in a place like that. And I also remember feeling how that sort of that burning desire to know something, and then how thrilling it felt to actually figure it out and then get to the information that, of course, was so hugely important to me at that moment. And so when I actually look back at my life all these years later, I really think that was really my first act of investigative reporting. And it was a moment that I think really kind of put inside of me this idea of being a journalist, even though I certainly didn't think of it that way at the time. I mostly just thought of it as, wow, I pulled off a real coup there.
It's like putting a puzzle together.
Yeah.
Was there a moment early in your career where you felt a story or a reaction to a story where you felt like you made the right decision to go into journalism?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's a really incredible thing to kind of pour your heart and soul into a story, and then to see it be published, and then to hear the people that you've written about when they come to you and they say, "Wow, thank you so much for actually just telling our story. Thank you so much for like caring enough to tell our story." And I had a number of those kinds of experiences early on where you could sort of feel the impact, right? Not in the way of like what laws got changed or whether bad guys went to jail, but really just the impact of what it means to give voice to people who haven't been heard. And that is a profound feeling, and that was something that made me feel immediately and instantly, wow, I really love doing this kind of work.
On a personal level, you felt it.
Yeah, I just, yeah, it's, it's the coolest thing about, I think, doing this kind of work is that it allows you, right, to hear people. It gives you the privilege, it gives you the immense privilege to hear people and hear their stories, and then it gives you the added responsibility then of how do I now transmit those stories in a way that's real and that connects with readers. And I just like, that's the part that keeps bringing me back for more.
And at Medill, you weren't on the Daily, right?
No.
Not on the Daily.
Those guys scared the hell out of me.
Are there Daily people here? Oh, well.
Yeah, you all scared the hell out of me.
So what did you learn at Medill that, in the classroom, that you were able to take with you into your first job and beyond?
Oh my gosh. Well, Roger Boy is here someplace, and And oh my gosh, yeah, thank you for all the lessons about writing and reporting. So I didn't come, like I had never been like the editor of my high school newspaper. I wasn't a cherub, so I didn't have really any journalism background whatsoever. The cherub scared the hell out of me too. And so like I really felt like, I felt quite intimidated actually by my fellow students when I came to Medill, and so I remember feeling inspired actually, because there was a Medill grad named Jeff Marks who won a Pulitzer Prize like a couple of years after graduating from Medill, and I remember interviewing him to writing a paper about him, and I remember being really inspired by his story. But I'll tell you, the class that really there was a class that really has guided me and has stuck with me for decades, and that was the law and ethics class, which at the time was taught by David Barstow. And like that class really, guys, you just don't realize how complicated it gets out there. And it was so incredibly important to understand the laws of libel and the laws of privacy and the power of the First Amendment and all the access questions. And that was a class that just, literally, I think from day one as a working reporter, I felt like that class was constantly helping me stay on the right path. So that was a really terrific thing. And then the other thing, one of the reasons why I came to Northwestern is because you got to take all these liberal arts classes. And I was really curious about everything, so I wanted to take it all. And journalism didn't dominate the curriculum. I really just, I wanted to have a taste of it, but I also was dying to learn about economics and poli-sci and all of that really good stuff. But the thing that I think, I don't know for sure that I decided with 100% certainty I was going to be a journalist until I did this thing called teaching newspaper, which I think you guys now call something else, like residency or something, right? And so I was dispatched to Green Bay, Wisconsin, to go to work for the Green Bay Press-Gazette, and I lived in the YMCA across the street from the newsroom. I still remember there's a guy who every morning would wash his socks in the communal bathroom like he was strangling a baby, and he scared the hell out of me. And but I just loved that newsroom. I loved what it felt like, what it smelled like, the grime of the place. I just so loved being in that newsroom, writing anything and everything under the sun. And that really was the place that sort of sealed the deal for me. It was actually being in a newsroom and feeling the rhythm and the pace and the excitement and the adrenaline and all of that in this little newspaper in Wisconsin. I'm so grateful that Medill sent me to Green Bay.
Even though it wasn't the bigger newspapers that other students were
No, all the cool daily Northwestern kids went to Miami and Boston and Philly. I got sent to Green Bay.
Do you still get a kick out of seeing your name on the front page of the New York Times? Do you still get a kick out of seeing your byline?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, of course I do. Your byline. So I work on these long stories that take months and months and months, and really, they all kind of feel a little bit like giving birth to a child. And you watch this, the story is published, and then you sort of stand back and watch what happens. And it's very surprising and unpredictable what happens, and you love all your children equally, of course. But that, your byline really is right. Is saying this ultimately, your stories, right, are such a deep reflection your value system, of what you think is important, and ultimately of what you think is newsworthy. And over time, over a career, they kind of add up to something. They add up to something about who you are as a person, and what do you ultimately stand for. And so that's why I still, to this day, I really, I love kind of adding to that story of I think ultimately what drives me as a person and as a journalist.
Do you remember your first big investigative story?
Oh my God, yes, I do. It was terrible. It was so bad. It was, oh God, I mean.
In St. Pete?
No. It was at the Rochester Times-Union, which after I graduated from Northwestern, I got hired by the Rochester Times-Union in upstate New York. And I was immediately assigned to cover a suburb of Rochester. And I hit upon an idea for a project that I somehow sold my editors into saying yes to. And it was like a really statistics-oriented, numbers-oriented thing. And I remember I thought I had to have for every point I made in the story, I just felt like I needed 3 quotes to support each point, right? And so it was just, it was so well-meaning and it was so terrible. And I used to keep on my desk for years, I kept a lead that I wrote when I was an intern at the Green Bay Press Gazette, and I was sent to write a story about a new train ride through the fall colors of Green Bay, right? So it's like really hard work to turn this into something gripping, and so I wrote this lead that describing in probably 45 or 50 words the engine of the train that was now leading this, and it described it as this black beast glistening in the sunlight, right? And it was such a monumentally bad lead, and I just felt like I needed to have this thing as a reminder of how hard it is to ultimately, especially in the beginning of a journalism career, to actually find your voice, right? To me, that was something that didn't come right away. It took me a long time, a lot of trial and error to figure out what actually is my voice, what's my writing voice as a journalist, and it took. I tried every gimmicky, horrible thing under the sun. I tried the one-word lead. I tried the quote from a Bob Dylan song lead. I tried the question lead. I tried I tried it. I had to go through and make all of those horrible mistakes in order to ultimately figure out and find a voice.
Investigative reporters spend a lot of time, in your case, months, if not more than a year, doing the reporting and the research. How much time do you invest in the writing?
As much as possible. I think the writing is something that unfortunately in investigative reporting traditionally has been overlooked. You see work that is it's important, and it's well-meaning, and it's revelatory, and yet it also kind of feels like you're eating a plate of broccoli. I'm sorry for anyone who loves broccoli, but I'm not a big broccoli fan. And I felt like I would go to IRE conferences, investigative reporters and editor conferences, and I would look at the printouts of various projects, and there was a kind of formula to so many of these projects. There would be sort of an overview story, day 1. Day 2 would be a sort of zoom in on a particular part of it, and day 3 was always solutions, right? It was like this thing, you just couldn't, and I didn't want to do that. I didn't think that those stories, they didn't connect with me, and so I didn't think they would connect with readers. And so I basically, because I ended up at the St. Petersburg Times, which was a newspaper that really was way out in front in terms of working on basically narrative storytelling in a newspaper with incredible people like Tom French and Ann Hull and David Finkel and this long line of amazing writers. And I was inspired by that and thought, well, gosh, I wonder, is there a way that I could somehow combine investigative reporting with narrative writing in order to tell stories that didn't feel like a plate of broccoli, but what I wanted, which was a 16-ounce ribeye. That's what I wanted to deliver. And so that's basically, really, for the last 3 decades, I've been just trying to figure out how to do that.
So let's fast forward to your most recent story on the president. What prompted you to decide to investigate the finances of the president, background and finances of Trump?
I think it was a recognition that had come from a story that I had done during the 2016, in the lead up to the 2016 election, when we had been mailed at the New York Times a couple of pages of Donald Trump's 1995 tax return. And those tax returns, when we ultimately were able to validate their authenticity, were remarkable because they showed that Donald Trump had lost over $900 million, or had reported a loss of over $900 million in his 1995 tax return. And that was like a kind of this revelation of basically how little we really knew about this man's finances. And it was that recognition that came from that first story that, my gosh, this man's about to be is president of the United States, and we actually know so little about where his money comes from and how he came by it, and is he a good businessman or isn't he a good businessman? We just decided to basically throw out everything we thought we knew about Donald Trump and just go back to ground zero. Just go back to literally, go back to the thing that Dick Haney, who also scared the hell out of me, said that, if your mother says she loves you, check it out, right? It was that simple. It was Donald Trump says this. He says he only got $1 million from his father and he had to pay it back with interest. Okay, let's check it out, right? And that's really where that came from, was just this recognition that we know so little about this person who's kind of been in our peripheral vision now for many, many decades, right? Really going back to the 70s. And he's been this kind of background music in all of our lives for so long. And then he's on TV, and he's The Apprentice, and he's the mogul, and he's on all these magazine covers. But really, ultimately, what do we actually know about this man? And it was that kind of simple impulse that drove the reporting for that story.
And that was not an incremental story. That story broke real ground. How did you keep that story secret in a newsroom filled with reporters?
Oh, gosh. We were basically in a hermetically sealed environment for 18 months. We set up in a room out away from the main newsroom. When we would bring in documents, we would bring them in on a freight elevator that was sort of off the beaten path. And then the door was locked at all times, the shades were drawn. Because we just felt like we needed to be super careful to protect not just the work that we were doing, but more importantly to protect the sources who were providing us with. At the end of the day, we ended up with about 100,000 pages of documents, none of them ever seen before, outside of the Trump orbit. So these were a couple hundred tax returns, bank statements, financial audits, all of the really good stuff that you need in order to get to kind of ground truth on someone's money.
And you use terms, we're very careful about the words we use, but you use terms in the top 3 paragraphs of that story like dubious tax schemes, outright fraud, tax dodging or dodging taxes. How hard was it for you to decide to use those words, and how many levels above you did it go up to be able to use terms like outright fraud in describing the president? Yeah,
so you don't use that lightly, right, with anyone, but especially the president of the United States. But actually there would be, I would say, there was a lot less toing and froing over that than you might think. And in part, it's because it wasn't like we were just spending all this time and then, and then sort of drop this bomb on our editors at the last moment. The editors were deeply involved. We're being briefed constantly about what we were up to, what we were finding, what the documents were showing. And I think because certainly those of us who had our bylines on top of that story understood the responsibility, right? The responsibility that comes with having your name on a story like that. It wasn't like we were rushing or trying to push to be sort of on the edge, or a saying I often use is, you don't want to drive beyond your headlights in a story. And so actually we felt we had endless and deep conversations about every single one of what I call in a story the fighting words. So every one of those phrases you just read, those are fighting words, right? And so we had long, deep conversations with top editors and also with our lawyers about what was underneath each one of those fighting words. What's actually underneath that in terms of evidence, facts, support, et cetera. But one of the things that I think we all felt committed to was being precise with language. We didn't want to like obfuscate or tiptoe around something if we could say something directly. And so when we all felt confident that many of these tax schemes were outright fraud, which especially those of you are, I don't know how many tax lawyers there are in this crowd, but tax lawyers know that tax law is this remarkably fuzzy thing where it's really hard for anyone to say with certainty that's fraud, okay? So we knew that that's what we were dealing with, was actually in a remarkably murky world where creative tax lawyers who make $1,200 an hour are able to basically claim that the most insane thing is perfectly legal. And so for us to say outright fraud, it meant we had been to a whole bunch of those $1,200 an hour tax lawyers who were looking exactly at the facts that we were describing, and they were saying, oh my God, this is so far over the line, right? This is something that we would never even dream of trying to justify, and would never pass muster. In the same conversations we would have with people who worked in the Justice Department who did tax fraud cases. So there's a lot of thought and thinking that goes into whether or not words like that are actually substantiated and are right and are actually the correct words to use. But when they are, by God, you want to tell the truth, right? You want to say what you found, and that's what we found.
I guess there's been big debate over whether we say the word lie in print in reference to the
Right.
president, so it must be kind of a very similar debate. How far can you go, and if the facts justify it?
Do the facts justify it? I mean, with the word lie, obviously, you're in that realm of what was the intent? What was the intent of behind a statement? And that's a similar kind of thing with outright fraud. There's a question of what was the intent? What was happening here? And so we felt really strongly that what we had uncovered and what we were able to lay out in this story fully justified, comfortably justified the use of those kinds of phrases.
What was the White House's reaction, and did you wind up in any tweets?
Okay, I'm just going to tell you guys, I was so hoping that Trump would tweet about me personally. I just was like, please, 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 God. So no, he pronounced, I think he definitely tweeted about the story. And then Sarah Sanders came out and said, oh, this is a long, boring story. But actually what was so interesting to me is there was a complete absence of pushback on any of the actual substance of the story. And it seemed like they settled pretty quickly on a strategy of let's just not talk about it, let's just say fake news, right? This is I think, part of the power of the persistent attacks on journalism from the White House of labeling everything as a fake news or enemy of the people, those kinds of phrases, give a kind of instant permission to people who are big supporters of the president to just simply ignore anything that comes under that rubric. And so I think that's what they decided to do in this particular case, much to my disappointment. I was really hoping that he would call me an idiot. That would have been great.
You would have saved that one.
I would have.
Many of us have family or friends or acquaintances who believe that the media is not always truthful. They believe the fake news. And how do you respond when you hear those terms being tossed around to friends, family, acquaintances, politicians? How do you respond to that as a journalist?
That's such a great question. First of all, I personally feel very skeptical toward the news myself. And so I'm actually not quick to sort of say, oh, ignore them, they're know-nothings. And I actually feel like journalism needs to respond, and needs to respond forthrightly, and do its level best to understand why people are skeptical, and then tell stories in ways that can give the public greater comfort and greater trust in what's underneath our stories. So you'll see in this particular story, we went to enormous lengths, for example, to link to original documents that were underneath all of the key findings in our story so that people could look for themselves. When I write the tops of stories, I really focus hard on writing the tops of stories in ways that I hope are signaling to readers, whatever else you think of this story, the one thing you don't have to worry about is that this is made up. In other words, so I try to be really specific. I try to attribute everything very carefully. I try to have named people, right, as opposed to unnamed sources. And I try to write stories that both are very clear up front about what we know and what we don't know, what the story is saying, but also what it's not saying, so that readers don't come away thinking, that oh gosh, they're blowing something out of proportion, or oh gosh, they're being they're using all those wiggle words like some and many and all those kind of words that, to me, when I read those words, make me worry, like, gosh, do they really have it? Do they really have it nailed? And so if in the top that I wrote to the Trump story, we were very precise, right? We documented 295 different ways that Fred Trump invented to funnel money into Donald Trump's pocket. We said, Donald Trump, by the time he was 2 years old, was making $200,000 a year in today's dollars, thanks to his father. By the time he was 8 years old, he was a millionaire in today's dollars. By the time he was 17, he had been given his first apartment building by his father. So really, like, precise things that, if they were wrong, right, would be easy to demonstrate that they were wrong. So things that convey, like, okay, wait a minute, this isn't just a lot of adjectives here. These are hard facts. And that's what I'm trying to, when I write in that fashion, it's literally because I'm thinking about the most skeptical readers that are out there, and I'm thinking about my own skepticism towards so much of the media that I see.
Do you think the mainstream media has fed in to this idea? Have we made mistakes, do you think, covering the Trump White House? Feeding into this idea? Yes, of course. I mean, I actually felt, I said this to a class earlier today, when we were working on the Trump story, we had this whiteboard in our hermetically sealed environment where we would put up stuff that occurred to us, interesting factoids, questions that we were asking. And at one point, I wrote across the top of the whiteboard what I thought should be the title of the story that we were writing. And the title I wrote was The Correction.
And the reason why I wrote that was because the thing that became so painfully obvious to us as we were doing the reporting on this story was how much the media itself, including, I'm so sad to report, the New York Times, the paper that I had given myself to for 20 years, that we had been so much the reason behind the creation of this myth of the self-made billionaire, because we hadn't done our jobs. Over and over, we spent some time in that story actually tearing apart the first major profile of Donald Trump ever done by a major news organization, which was done by the New York Times in the 1970s. And virtually every single word of that story was wrong. And one of the things you discover in journalism is that the first bad reporting that occurs on a topic often infects all the reporting that follows. And sure enough, all of those early mistakes just got repeated through the years as Donald Trump would be covered by, whether it was 60 Minutes or whether it was magazine profiles, the same basic errors that were made in that first piece. You could just see how they infected coverage for years and years to come. And so by the time this man is running for president in 2016, the myth of Donald Trump, self-made billionaire, was just so baked in to decades of news coverage. And yes, there were the occasional dissenting voices, but by and large, when you looked at the news coverage of Donald Trump up until 2016, they all essentially bought in to the same basic narrative of this guy who had had some spectacular rises and falls, but ultimately had made a vast sum of money by dint of his own ingenuity and perseverance.
Wow. It was an incredible story. We have a lot of students in the room. You have a son who's an engineer.
Me too.
What would you have said to your, that's my question. What would you have said to your son if he said, Dad, I want to be an investigative reporter, knowing what you know about this evolving, shrinking, changing industry? What advice would you have given
That's
him?
a mean question.
Would you have said, no, please don't? Or would you have said?
I think like any parent, I would have been worried on one level because it's a really brutal business to go into right now. But I think ultimately, if he had decided to go that route, I would have felt much the way I feel looking at all of you in this room today, which is I feel just enormous admiration and pride in you all stepping forward, knowing everything that you know. I'm sure all of your parents said you were insane, and yet you've stepped forward to do this thing that is so remarkably important and difficult and often thankless, and yet, and so I'm really sort of in awe of the guts that I see in the faces of you students who are sitting here today. I think it's of profound importance right now that you all are taking up this cause. I think that when I entered journalism, the main battle really was between the world of facts and the world of spin, the world of public relations. And today I actually think it's a much starker contest between the world of truth and the kingdom of lies. And I say that really carefully. That there's a greater and greater willingness in more and more parts of the world for our leaders, our political leaders and our business leaders to just spout utter nonsense. And that battle, the outcome of that battle between the world of truth and facts and the kingdom of lies, so much rides on that. And your generation just absolutely needs to be at the forefront of determining the outcome of that contest. So I'm in awe of you, and if my son had decided to do this, I think I would be in awe of him, although I'm in awe of him in any event. But so that's the way I feel.
We have a lot of talented students here who want to do all kinds of things in journalism, not just investigative journalism.
Yeah.
But my last question would be, what kind of advice would you have for next steps, knowing what you know about the changing state of the industry when they leave Medill?
I would say, that what's so important at this moment in your lives is to really grapple with the question I raised a moment ago about trying to figure out what is your voice, right? What kind of storyteller do you actually want to be? It's such a tough question to answer. And it's not just, are you an investigative reporter, but it's like, are you a print person, right? Is that the main way you want to tell stories? Or maybe you're thinking about podcasts and you're thinking that's a more comfortable way. Or maybe it's documentary, or maybe it's something else we haven't even invented yet. But like that question of figuring out what kind of storyteller do you want to become, and then focusing relentlessly on trying to master that, right? I mean, the one thing it used to drive me crazy with journalism schools who were trying to teach journalism students to do it all and to be able to blog and tweet and write this and shoot video and cut audio and like, gosh, don't do that. Figure out what kind of storyteller you want to be, and then just relentlessly pursue excellence at that. And because they're all quite different, right? Every one of those things is really, really different. I wouldn't even pretend to think that I knew the first thing about how to make a documentary film. They all have specific strengths and weaknesses as formats for storytelling, and getting great at becoming a storyteller in any one of those things is a lifelong pursuit. But that pursuit of excellence in the kind of storyteller you want to become, I think, is the way to go, as opposed to try to become a kind of one-man band.
Great advice. Questions for David?
Hi. 18 months is an incredibly long time in the Trump world, with all the news coming out of there every day. How did you find the patience to fully follow the story where it led you, and not just, I don't know, you were sitting on all these hundreds of thousands of documents. How did you find that patience?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So you're only working on like the most competitive story out there, right? And it's a nauseating feeling. I mean, it's really a nauseating feeling to every day wake up and worry that somehow, somewhere, someone else will put their hands on the thing that you're working on and get there first. But at the same time, I think we drew comfort in the fact that the thing that we were really looking at was not where everybody else was. You know, everybody else was chasing after Russia, and they were chasing after Stormy Daniels, and they were chasing after what's happening in the White House. And so I think we drew comfort in the fact that we knew, first of all, how difficult it was to amass this trove of 100,000 pages. And we were pretty well wired into Trump world to know whether anybody else might be creeping around the edges of this story. But the thing that I always, I've stressed over and over again, especially to younger investigative reporters, is exactly the point you made. It's the importance of being patient for your story, right? You're in this crazy sprint that's also a marathon with anxious editors who are like, where's the story, right? And it's competitive. And we had a really good story within the first 6 months that we could have written, but we saw that there was a potential to tell an even better story if we just stuck with it. And then a year in, we thought, wow, we have an amazing story, but we had the patience to see that if we put a few more pieces of the puzzle together, it would lift the story up to here and allow us to tell a story that was truly revelatory, right, about Donald Trump. No one, I would say, I know a lot of people will say to me, gosh, I thought that story was going to have a bigger impact. I thought it was going to have congressional inquiries were going to happen and the IRS was going to, jump on this guy. And it didn't seem like very much happened. But actually, that's actually what's interesting to me is how much did happen. Because after that story was published, it changed instantly the way people thought about this man, right? It actually changed what they thought they knew about this man. And the ability to actually help people get closer to the truth, the reality, right, of how Donald Trump got rich, to me is the single most important thing that you could do, the most important outcome that you could have in a story like that. So it was like the ability to be patient for your story to be kind of all that it can be, is such a difficult thing to do when you're feeling the competitive pressures, the pressures from your bosses, your own internal pressures of all of the stuff that you're carrying. But it's absolutely critical, at least in my experience, to being able to tell the 16-ounce steak stories that I'm talking about, that I'm aiming for.
Thank you so much. I've been interested recently in the rise of the nonprofit newsroom, these reporters who are kind of breaking off and following their own stories. And I was curious about, in a publication as Storied as the New York Times, you touched on this, what your relationship is between your kind of closed off team and this editorial board that's trying to get this story and get it out there, and what your process is for finding sources and aspects of the story, but yet kind of balancing that confidentiality with that higher editorial board.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I follow your question. Can you try again?
In other words, I guess, what is your relationship between your investigative team and sort of the higher ups, the editors who are who want to know about the story and who want to know when it's going to get published?
It's just such a wonderful, loving relationship. No, it's a great question, and when I started as an investigative reporter, I had a very different approach to this question, and I said this earlier to a group of students that I used to basically I wanted as little to do with my editors as I possibly could. When I saw them coming toward me, I would walk in the other direction. I just when I couldn't walk in the other direction soon enough, I would pick up the phone and pretend to be on a call, right? Just anything to keep them away and off my back, because I didn't want that feeling of someone breathing down your back was just kind of toxic to me. But as I've gone deeper down the road of doing this kind of work, I actually ended up flipping and going the other way. And now what I try to do is I try to grip my editors in a bear hug and pull them into the quicksand with me. So I literally, I'll give my editors homework. I'll give them homework assignments. I'll give them reading assignments. I will make them read interview notes. I'll make them read memos. And I try to pull them into the journey with me so that they know the ups and they know the downs. They know what the problems are. They know where the weak points are. And I try to pull them in, especially to the questions about sources and sourcing, so that because I've found over time that actually pulling them into the quicksand with me is really important to my ultimate ability to carry the burden of these stories. It helps to have company in the foxhole, if you will. And so my approach nowadays is quite different from it was when I first started out.
Do you tell your editors or some of your editors who your sources are?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was one of the things. We had this big scandal at the New York Times, this guy named Jason Blair, who was making up stuff. And one of the things that we learned as an institution from that was the importance of editors actually having the conversation about sourcing with reporters, because in his case, he was actually just making up sources, which was horrifying.
Thank you. I was wondering, what caused your biggest moment of self-doubt as a journalist, and how did you overcome that?
Oh gosh, that's a great, really good question. For sure, I can answer that question. It was. So I talked about it a little bit this morning. One of my first investigative projects, it happened in my third year as a journalist. It wasn't the first one that I talked about that was so terrible. This one actually was really good, and it was about a sacred cow in Rochester, New York, the local United Way, and it was about some terrible misspending that was occurring by the local United Way. But this was a very sensitive story because Rochester's really a company town. Kodak was there, Xerox was there, and all of the CEOs were sat on the United Way board, including the publisher of my newspaper and including the CEO of the largest grocery store chain, which was also the biggest advertiser of our newspaper. So I knew that this was a very sensitive story, and we treated it very carefully. And the night before publication, I went home to take a nap to come back in and do the final fact checking. And when I left, the story had been laid out, and it was a huge front page layout, and then it jumped to 2 full inside pages of very carefully thought out, beautiful prose. And when I came back that night, my editor called me in, and the layout was in front of him, and there were these big red markers all across the 2 pages with X's through them. And what had happened was the publisher had demanded to see the story, which never happened. And then it later turned out it was because the grocery store CEO had leaned on him to do something about this, to stop this story from doing the damage that they thought it would do to the United Way, and also to their reputations for having not overseen this sacred cow very well. And so instead of it being a full 2 pages, it was down to 1 page. And instead of it being a big front page story, it was sort of clinging to the bottom right-hand corner of page 1. And this was an absolutely devastating moment for me as a young reporter. And I was like just racking my head for what to do. And my wife and I, we didn't have enough money to say, the heck with you. And so I couldn't quit on the spot, which is what I wanted to do. And so the only thing I could think of to do was to insist that they take my byline off that story. They leaned on me. They tried to get me to put it back on. They said, "Oh no, it's still a really good story. It's a really important story. This is bad to take your name off of this." But I stuck to my guns. The story ran without my name on it, and that created a kind of mini journalism scandal in Rochester, New York. And ultimately, it ended up causing quite a stir. But that moment, I really was like, I was, so brokenhearted about what had happened, and it was against everything that had pulled me into journalism in the first place that I immediately started applying to law school. Because I was going to become like a First Amendment lawyer, right? And I was all set to go, and then a friend of mine called and said, you should give journalism one more chance. And there's a job opening down in Florida at the St. Petersburg Times, and they're a completely different kind of newspaper. Give it a shot. And so I flew down to St. Petersburg, and I met the person who became a real hero to me, a man by the name of Paul Tash, who is the editor of the St. Petersburg Times and would become the publisher of the St. Petersburg Times, and was someone who just had this sort of steely resolve about what journalists should be about. And I'm so glad that I went there and I met him and I didn't bail.
Cool, thanks. That's louder than I thought. You talk about these, the 16-ounce ribeye steak story that this most recent investigation of yours most certainly was, but you also talk about it taking, 18 months. And with a story that's as influential as this, and at 6 months you undoubtedly knew was going to be a great story, and a very influential one, how do you reconcile between the need and the want to put out, the best story you can, and to put out that story so that the public knows about it sooner than later?
Wow, you sound just like Dean Baquet, the executive editor of the New York Times. Another really, really good question. So yeah, it goes into the deep conversation about what we had and versus what we thought we might have with a few months more work, and whether or not that bigger, deeper, richer, more textured, more ultimately credible story would be worth the sacrifice of not getting out a pretty good story a few months sooner. Those are the kinds of judgments, by the way, that get made like day in and day out. It's why editors get paid the big bucks, is because they're constantly making those judgments. And I'm a huge fan of what I call the rolling investigation, which is where you don't save it all up after 18 months, but actually you just start writing stories, and you break a piece, and then a month later you break another piece, and then a couple weeks later you break another piece. And there are wonderful examples of that kind of reporting that happen all the time at newspapers and news organizations all over the country. But in this particular case, being able to essentially, really what we were doing at the end of the day was delivering an entirely brand new financial biography of the 45th president of the United States. Being able to tell that story and deliver that story in whole, right, felt like something that was well worth the extra time that we spent on that story.
I thought it was interesting how you talked about how the media was kind of responsible for creating this image of the self-made billionaire among Trump. So even after your story and others have kind of debunked that, do you think there's more that can be done by journalists to kind of debunk the idea of the self-made billionaire among the elite who kind of hide behind this title to shadow corruption?
Oh, what a great question. Yeah, I definitely do, 100%, right? One of the things that breaks my heart, and it's one of the reasons why I'm so happy to see you guys in this room, is there's a fundamental mismatch between the number of people who do this kind of work and the number of stories out there that really are crying out for people like us to do this kind of work. And so I'm hoping all of you, right, will embrace the challenge of doing this type of in-depth, serious reporting, because there are any number of powerful, right? We all are well aware of the fact that the people who are the wealthiest people in the world, when you compare them to their cohort from 20 years ago, it's like not even in the same galaxy, right? And so with that wealth comes enormous concentrated power. And so my big thing on the reason why I think God invented investigative reporting was to chase after concentrated power. And so we need more. We just need more people, more reporters doing impactful investigative reporting that is aimed directly at those who actually have the most concentrated power in our society and in our culture.
And that's not just the national level, that's local accountability reporting as well.
Yep, local, national, international, global, it's everywhere.
Hi.
Hi.
So I know that one of your Pulitzer, which is kind of a funny thing to say, but one of your Pulitzers was for reporting on some of the political machinations behind the war in Iraq. We're now around 20 years into perpetual war in the Middle East. Knowing what you know now, how have the discourses around the war in Iraq affected discourse around war in the Middle East now?
Boy, that's a big question, a difficult question. I mean, the really sad fact is that the war on terror, right, has just kind of faded from the discussion for the most part, right? Rarely do we see much coverage about what's actually happening in Iraq or what's actually happening in Afghanistan. It was nowhere near the way it was, especially in the, in 2002, 2003, 2004, when we were all completely and entirely consumed by the war on terror. The thing that I wrote about that you're referring to, that you're alluding to, was basically a secret propaganda campaign executed by the Pentagon and the Bush White House, using and enlisting retired military generals who would appear on TV as like experts, right, talking about how wonderful the war on terror was going, using talking points that had fed to them by the White House and by the Pentagon, and in exchange for being basically sock puppets, repeating like a sort of a Greek chorus, these wonderful talking points, also then would get great access to the people who were responsible for divvying out contracts related to the war on terror. That was the gist of that story. And I think like I'm have a deep interest. I mentioned earlier that I'm a huge skeptic of the media. Well, one of the reasons why I'm a huge skeptic of the media is A, because of that story, and B, because I see vestiges of those systems infecting a lot of, especially the news coverage, on not just the war on terror, but on any number of other things, day in and day out. It's unfortunately it's such a handy business model for TV networks to sort of assemble these panels of experts to weigh in on the news of the day. It's cheap, right? It's relatively cheap, but then they're failing terribly. These are the news networks at actually disclosing why these people are on TV, right? Like what their day jobs actually are, and that they're not just there doing a favor, right? They're there because they actually represent very big corporate interests who are all jockeying in Washington for a piece of the pie. And so I think it's really still something that I notice day in and day out, kind of infecting the media discourse in lots of different ways, on healthcare, on the environment, on guns, on the war, on a million different things. Makes me nuts.
So this is kind of more of an advice-oriented question. But when you're a young journalist, maybe it's your first job, and you're going out into a newsroom and you want to be an investigative reporter, how do you go from like the stories that they just give to the brand new reporter to becoming an investigative reporter and going after these big issues and the big topics?
Yeah, so I was that reporter, right? Trying to figure that one out. And I hit upon something pretty quick in my career, which was, okay, if I'm really going to get a chance to do stories that I actually want to do, and not just feed the beast every day, I'm going to have to recognize and accept the fact that I really have two jobs. I have a day job, which is feeding the beast, and then I have a night and weekend job, which is basically when I'm going to be Secret Agent Barstow. And I'm gonna set a goal for the year of doing 5 stories that I care about, that I'm proud of, and that I would want my mom and dad to read. And so what I would do was I would gather string on a story idea, on a story that I was interested in, and I wouldn't tell my bosses, I wouldn't say a word until I knew for a fact that I could actually deliver a really good story. And then I would go to them and I would say, listen, if you could just give me 2 days, just give me 2 days, I will deliver a story that we will all be excited about and proud of, and that could be on the front page on the Sunday paper. And then I would make damn sure to deliver, right? Then the next time, I would come back and I'd say, you know, if you could just give me like 3 days, right? And then can you give me a week, right? And I basically, my entire career has been built around this conception of constantly asking my bosses to make slightly larger bets on me. Because when you put yourself in the shoes of your editors, and you come in and you're full of ambition and you want to do great stuff, and you go to the boss and you're like, please, if you just give me like 3 months, I'll give you a really great story about whatever, right? The juvenile justice system in Evanston. And the editor's looking at you, and they're basically, editors, for all their flaws, which are many, they're journalists, and they want to say yes, right? They want good stories. They want to break news. But when they look at you, they're basically wondering, are you going to pay off this bet, right? Are you going to pay off this bet? And if they can't answer that question comfortably, then they're going to have a hard time saying, go for it, right? So I put myself in the shoes of my bosses, and I basically thought, okay, I need to develop a track record of paying off these bets on much smaller stories. But if I had walked into the New York Times 20 years ago, and I had gone to the executive editor of the New York Times and I said, boss, okay, just give me 18 months and I'm going to investigate the finances of the President of the United States. It's going to be a great story. He would have thrown me out, and rightly so. He would have said, are you kidding me? And so everything about the way I've organized my career has really revolved around that simple idea of just asking editors to make a slightly larger bet than the bet I paid off the last time. It's a really great way to think about your career, especially in the early stages.
Hi, David. First, I want to congratulate you for your extraordinary career and follow up on something that you alluded to regarding the impact of the story about Trump and the finances and so forth. And it seems that with national investigative reporting, increasingly these stories very quickly fall into the vortex of tribalism and the kind of tribal nature of the media on each side. And it seems like those citizens who were disposed to one side of the aisle thought the reporting was incredible, and those who weren't disposed to believe it quickly dismissed it. What would you say in terms of how it might be possible to get these crucial, very, very factually supported stories to get more traction? And B, how would you contrast today's environment with years ago when you first started in the field?
Well, it's been an interesting couple of years. When you do investigative reporting, you don't always win the popularity contest. And, people call up and they write mean things to you and they say you're a scumbag or all those things. But I think those of us who do investigative reporting have noticed in the last couple of years something changed in the tone of the kinds of emails and phone calls and phone messages we've been getting. And there's the level of sort of rage and the level of it's not just like you're a terrible reporter and you don't know what you're doing. There's a level of there are death threats now. You're vermin. You should be erased from the face of the earth. There's a level of rage and vitriol that I know all of the folks who do this kind of work, we've all talked about this and noticed that something really changed. I noticed this afternoon there was a story about how I don't actually get that upset by the fake news thing, but what really upsets me is the enemy of the state phrase. That phrase especially upsets me because if you just follow the logic of the sentence, you know, these corrupt journalists are peddling fake news to destroy America, therefore they are the enemy of the state. And if you think through the logic, that little logic circle there, it ends in a very bad place. And one of the things that I noticed at the New York Times is, not that many months ago, we were forced to put up big cement blocks around the entrance of the New York Times because we were getting so many death threats. Just today, a judge sentenced a man to 4 months in prison for calling up the Boston Globe again and again and again and threatening to kill the journalist and saying that they were enemies of the people. We all know about the case of the guy who sent basically fake pipe bombs to CNN and the New York Times. And so we definitely feel that in a very direct way in our day-to-day work. I'm sure, Debbie, you've experienced this.
Look what happened in Annapolis.
Yes, in Annapolis. And so this is the thing that actually worries me way more than the fake news thing, is that brand enemy of the people because of the logic tree that it creates. But I also will say at the same time, there's this other thing that we've noticed, which is and maybe this comes to the tribalism point that you're making. One thing that happens to me increasingly is when I'm like on a plane and somebody will say, well, what do you do? And I sort of swallow hard and I say, well, I'm a journalist. What's interesting to me is how often people will now actually lay hands on me and say, oh my God, thank you so much, right? Which is different, right? I never experienced that either. It was like they will literally like grab your forearm and say, my God, the work that you're doing is so important, please don't stop, right? So you're sort of seeing this in both ways, which goes to your tribalism point. And so it's different, right? It's definitely different than it was, 10 years ago. And I think that it's something like it's what I alluded to in my answer earlier about the importance of actually not dismissing those reactions and not simply saying, well, those knuckleheads, they're just going to believe what they're going to believe and it doesn't matter what I write. I actually don't agree with that at all. I think that we need to try our hardest to raise our game and do better journalism of verifiable facts, doing it with greater transparency and showing people how we did what we did and why we got to where we got, so that we give people every opportunity to kind of take the work in, and maybe it won't. We all have friends, people that we love dearly, who are deeply skeptical of the news, and I often think of those people in my life who I know are deeply skeptical of the news, and I just think, how can I write my story so that I can reach that person and they can read this story and walk away thinking, okay, at least it's not fake, right? So I'm like, I think all of us in this room and all of us in journalism really should not be defensive, but actually should take up the challenge of actually just doing our jobs better.
Thank you for these great questions. We have time for one more.
Thanks for coming home, and
Thanks.
we hope you'll come
Great to be here.
often. A question for both of you has to do with collaboration. So you haven't talked much about your partners yet in the reporting for the Pulitzers. And I know, Debbie, you run team investigations, so I'd like to hear a little about how that works.
Well, it's both a blessing and a curse. And I think you answered it in class earlier today. If you're working with good people and everyone knows their roles and it can be absolutely wonderful, and other times not so much. It can be a frustrating experience at some points. But I've worked with teams for a long, long time, and often it turns out well.
I think, first of all, collaboration is going to be, we're going to see more and more collaborations, especially because so many of our stories, right, are really now, they're just obliterating whatever the national boundaries are. And so when I was working on the Walmart story, we have a bureau in Mexico City, but I was determined to try to find the best reporter I could find in Mexico who could partner with me and collaborate with me, because I just had this sense that having that, that knowledge and that in-depth sense of, especially, this was a story about Walmart bribing local officials to get store permits in order to build new stores. I just felt like that was essential to our chances of being successful there. And so I asked around, and everyone kept saying the same name, Alejandra Zanik von Bertrab, who's this miracle of a human being and a stunning reporter. And we teamed up together, right, for that work. That was a 2-year project. There's no way we could have pulled that story off without actually a willingness to collaborate, right? And so collaboration is going to be, I think, a big part of your futures, especially with the way, not just the complexity of the stories and the cost of the stories, but there's just a big sea change in journalism itself in favor of and open to collaboration. So you would have seen, there's a new Netflix series called Unbelievable, right? Is it Unbelievable? Which is based on a collaboration between 2 reporters from 2 different news organizations who were kind of stumbled across each other in the course of doing a story. And so I think like that being open to collaborations is great, but as Debbie said, managing collaborations is a whole, it's a whole set of new challenges in order to make those collaborations work well.
It can definitely cause headaches for editors who are trying to manage. But like you said, having people on the ground in the community that you're covering so that national media doesn't swoop in, pretend to be experts and swoop out and do a story, it helps to have people who really understand the communities that we're covering. I have one last question real quick, if we can, for 30 seconds.
Sure.
So this silly question, but were you just as excited to win your 4th Pulitzer as you were your 1st Pulitzer? Or did it wear off? Did it wear off after a while? Or?
I sort of worried after the first one that people would think maybe I just got lucky. And then after the second one, I thought, people thought I got lucky again. So winning number 4 really felt great, because then I felt like, okay, it's not luck. What's that? And it feels terrific. Yeah, it feels really great.
That's
yeah,
great.
it's
David,
wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much on behalf of Medill. Thank you.
Thank you.
You did great.
Thank you.
Yeah.